Basically, as I mentioned before, I use computational tools to analyze large data sets. One of the data sets that I've been working a lot with is a data set of news media, news and opinion articles over the last 50 years. So I think I've been the first one to report and to publish and to document a huge spike in news media in the number of references that they do to terms that signify prejudice. So I think this figure encapsulates this trend pretty well. So the x-axis here is time since the 1970s until 2019. The y-axis is the relative frequency, so number of mentions divided by the total number of words generated by the outlet in the year.
And the blue and red lines denote different newspapers, is that right?
The blue line is the time series of the New York Times, and the red one is the Washington Post, two of the most important newspapers in the United States. And what you can see is that there's post-2010, which is indicated here with the dark gray background, there's this exponential growth in the usage of terms that denote prejudice: racism, racist, sexist, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, etc. And it's quite significant. So racist is up by over 600% in the New York Times. Misogyny is up by over 900% since 2010. White supremacy is up by over 4,000% in the New York Times, almost 6,000% in the Washington Post. So very, very substantial increases. And this is not circumscribed just to left-leaning newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's all over the media. So for example, this is an analysis of 47 popular news media outlets, 27 million news articles, and you see the same trends.
Yes.
2010. A common reaction when people see these charts is to attribute this spike to Donald Trump, to all the controversy surrounding that presidency, etc. But I actually show in the paper that this trend started before Donald Trump. So if you look at this analysis here, Donald Trump announced his candidacy to the Republican Party nomination for the US presidency in mid-2015. But 1 year before that, in 2014, the usage of many of these words were at record high up to that time. So for example, the usage of homophobia and homophobic in 2014 were at a record high. They had never been used as much in the previous year. The same for racism and racist. The same for sexism and sexist, with the exception of 2008, which was the year in which Hillary Clinton competed with Barack Obama for the nomination of the Democratic Party to the presidency of the US. So already in 2014, there was this spike was already noticeable. So I think, obviously these processes are probably very complex and multifactorial, like the reasons why this is happening. But I think what was happening is that, I don't know if you probably can see in these previous graphs that in the 1990s, there was like a very mild wave of this sort of rhetoric in news media. And I think what happened is that post 2010, there was probably like a similar, relatively mild wave. And then with the election of Donald Trump and the polarization that happened with half of the population hating him and the other half liking him, that probably reinforced this trend. That's my opinion. But obviously, it's very difficult to disentangle all these because probably all these trends are probably overdetermined. But I think that might be what is going on.
I mean, we might see Donald Trump as one cultural phenomenon, as it were, albeit quite a powerful one amongst many, and certainly his bid for the presidency and his ultimate success in gaining the presidency was part of a cultural process. I mean, we can see in other research, especially from the Pew Foundation, that the two sides of American politics have started to rate one another with more and more hostility over time, well before Trump came on the scene. So it seems to be part of a larger trend, and he fits into that, and certainly the fact that he was himself pretty polarizing may well have driven it harder, but it was, as you say, already there.
I think it was like a reinforcer within positive feedback loop. And also like further evidence that this was just not exclusively could be attributed exclusively to Trump is that this is also happening in other countries that don't have much to do with the United States. So for example, this is a similar analysis that I did in the main newspaper in Spain, which is called El País. It's sort of like the New York Times. It's considered the newspaper of record in the country, is left-leaning. And you also see this increase over time in the usage of these terms.
Yeah.
So it's also happening in Spain, and it's also happening in the UK. So here you have an analysis of UK news media, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, the BBC, etc. And you also see like these increases, and they started before Trump. So you see like the spikes in sex, like gender prejudice started like post 2010, but well before 2015.
I haven't studied the graphs in enough detail to see, but it looks as if the upward spike started at a very similar time in different countries.
Yes. Yes, something happened around 2010. I mean, it's easy to blame social media for everything. Perhaps they have a role. They are, as I mentioned before, very difficult to disentangle the causes behind this. But we can speak to what the data says. And for example, another interesting pattern, I think, is, for example, here in the UK media, but you also see the same in the American news media. You see that, for example, left-leaning outlets here in blue, they tend to use this terminology more than right-leaning outlets. But the right-leaning outlets are also increasing their usage of this terminology. And there is an exception to this, which is the topic of anti-Semitism, where it's the exact reverse. Right-leaning news media mention anti-Semitism more than left-leaning news media.
Right. So in that case, I mean, it strikes me, just in terms of my own knowledge of UK politics, for example, that the idea that Jeremy Corbyn, for example, was anti-Semitic was used by the conservative right in the UK, justly or not. I mean, I think it had a certain amount of justice to it myself, but you know, that was part of the discourse that the right-wingers in the UK sort of took up.
Yeah. And this, I mean, so far I've been showing charts that focus in these terms that signify prejudice, different types of prejudice, but similar phenomena are also happening for a different set of terms, and they are surprisingly correlated with each other. So for example, when you look at terms that are often associated with social justice discourse, like diversity, equality, inclusiveness, fairness, etc., you see the same sort of upwards trends.
Not quite as pronounced as the words like sexism and racism and so on.
I mean, well, it depends which terms you choose. I mean, if you look at cultural appropriation, you know, like, I mean,
right.
the term was basically not used until 2010, and then the increase is huge.
And white privilege is a big, it comes out of nowhere. And also I noticed gender pronouns, that's sort of not even a thing. And then it becomes a thing.
Etc. And another set of terms that I think is very interesting and highly related to all these trends is terms that denote political extremism. So this is a different analysis, a different paper in which I look at American and UK news media and how often they mention terms that signify political extremism. And I use a symmetric set of terms to have a fair comparison. So far right, far left, radical left, extreme right, extreme left. The top row is American news media. The bottom row is British news media. And you see similar trends in the sense that post-2010, there's a spike in the usage of this terminology. But also another glaring trend is that the news media in general is much more likely to mention the far right than the far left. There's a few exceptions to this. So if I look more in detail, for example, to outlets such as Breitbart that are clearly right-wing, or the Daily Wire, they mention the far left in blue more than the far right. But in general, most news media mentions the far right more than the far left. And even newspapers that are supposedly to be slightly right of center, like the Wall Street Journal, they mention the far right more than the far left. And this was not always the case, because this is an analysis from 2000 to 2019. But for example, when you look at like further back in time, in the 1970s, the New York Times used to mention the far right similarly, in like a similar amount of times as to the far the far right, like the mentions of far left and far right were pretty similar in the 1970s. And it's only in the 1980s where they decouple and they start to mention the far right way more than the far left.
Yeah, and the divergence coincides with the increase, in fact. So back in the 1970s, neither term was mentioned much, but to the extent that they were, it was quite equal. But then the term far right starts to take off, whereas the term far left shows a small spike much later, but it doesn't really increase to nearly the same degree.
But be careful, because the figure is misleading, because you are starting from different points. The increase is actually quite similar. It's just that they mention the far right much more. But for example, when you look at the New York Times from 2015 to 2019, they increased their mentions of far right by 260%, but they increased their mentions of far left by over 300%. You just don't see it because the scale is much smaller.
Oh, I see. It's from a lower base, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
These numbers are so small that the increase doesn't seem like much, but when you look at the percentual increase, it's actually huge.
I'm wondering if your research sheds any light on the contexts in which these words are used.
Yeah. We can talk about that later. I have a few slides about those techniques. The last thing I wanted to say about this analysis of news media is that all these trends are highly interconnected and related. So, for example, here I'm visualizing how the media mentions political extremism, words that denote prejudice in orange, and terms associated with social justice discourse in green. And I normalize here with something called min-max scaling. So you basically neutralize like the overall absolute frequency of words, but you do this normalization so you can see maximums and minima. And what you see is that all these terms start to spike post 2010, and they are like the time series are highly correlated with each other. So there's something that is driving this phenomena, and it's highly interconnected. Political extremism, words that signify prejudice, and words that are often associated with social justice discourse.
Okay, so that's fantastic. I mean, just the data that you've sort of drawn out there and made clear is just really fantastic, and it gives us a great sense of, well, one thing which is going on. But as you said, it's one thing to trace the frequency of these words, and another thing to suggest hypotheses as to why this is happening. So again, just
to that, if you want, we can move to that.
Yeah. So I was just going to suggest, though, I mean, so maybe you could look at these results, I suppose, and say, well, maybe this just reflects real world trends. I mean, maybe there has been an explosion in far right activity, especially on the internet, and maybe, the reason that all these social justice terms are increasing in frequency is that people have just been convinced that this is actually the right way of seeing things. And yes, our systems are racist and sexist, and everyone is realizing this at the same time, and it's reflecting something real about the world.
I mean, without getting into the realm of speculation of like the sociological reasons behind this, I think again we can look at the data to sort of try to draw inspiration about the dynamics and the relationships between these trends. And I think a highly significant set of results associated to this analysis is another analysis that I did, but instead of news media content, of scientific and academic content. So looking at millions of academic articles that have been published over the last century, and looking at the same set of terms and comparing them to the media. And I think there's some interesting results there. So if you want, we can go there.
Certainly.
Okay, so this is a similar analysis looking at the same set of prejudice signifying words, but instead of news media, here we are looking at academic publishing. So things that are published in scientific and academic journals. And there's some very interesting patterns here. The first one is how often academic papers mention terms that signify ethnic or racial prejudice. So this chart very nicely illustrates that this has happened over 4 waves over the last almost century. So it started after World War II with a minor wave. There was a second large wave at the end of the 1960s. There was a third one in the so-called politically correct 1990s, beginning of 2000s. And we are just going through the last one, post-2010. And an important dynamic in this chart is that these are not blips that come and go. I mean, each new wave creates a new baseline, which is higher than the previous one. So I think that trend is important. Another important trend, for example, if you look at the anti-Semitism chart, you see that there's this huge spike like after the Second World War, but then interest in this topic doesn't increase much in the academic literature. This is in a like in very large contrast with news media, where if you recall these charts, there's a very substantial increase in mentions of anti-Semitism in news media, also of all the other types of prejudice. But in the academy, this is not the case. So this suggests that at least for the topic of anti-Semitism, there's like a large decoupling between news media and the academy. Other interesting dynamics are, for example, sexual orientation prejudice. It rises during the 1980s, during the midst of the AIDS epidemic. And the gender prejudice is very interesting. I put here another graph that compares both the ethnic prejudice and the gender prejudice. So here in red, you can see the time series of prevalence of ethnic prejudice in the academic literature. And in green, you see the trends for gender prejudice. And what is interesting for me in this figure is that the concept of gender prejudice didn't exist basically in the academic literature prior to basically the 1970s. And it's sort of like the academics that popularized this notion, they look at the literature, the emerging literature on the topic of ethnic prejudice, and they mimic that in a way, just with a few years of latency. I don't know if it was the same academics or just other academics looking at this field, but this latency lag here, I think, is extremely interesting, of just a few years. And yeah, the same or very similar patterns also for terminology that is associated with social justice discourse, diversity, equity, inclusion. They are all rising in prevalence in the academic literature. And I think one of the most interesting takeaways of this work, comparing news media, the institution of news media and the academy, is that here you have like dozens of time series of different terms, etc. There's this method in data analysis, which is called factor analysis, to sort of summarize all these trends into an underlying pattern that captures most of the variance that we see in these charts. So when I did this for both the academic content and the news media content, I found that in academic content, which is the blue time series here, you see a gradual increase in the prevalence of this terminology over time since the 1980s. And then it accelerates post 2013 or something like that, but it has been relatively gradual. And in news media, which is the orange time series, it's a slightly different trend. It's much more stable over time and then took off dramatically post 2010.
But in both cases, you're saying there's a single factor or construct, if you will, that underlies all of these terminologies in both media and in academic literature.
Yeah, there's like a single factor that explains almost 60% of the variance of the analysis of all these terms that denote prejudice. And you see very similar results for the social justice associated terminology.
I might just add for the non-social scientists amongst our listeners that 60% of variance explained is very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, basically, these terms, like at different points in time, they have been growing, and the growth has been relatively gradual in comparison to news media. In news media, the prevalence of most of these terms was relatively stable for many decades, and then it exploded post 2010. And I mean, this is an interesting technique, method like factor analysis, where you can quantify the effect and all that, but this is pretty obvious when you just look at the data, right?
Yeah.
So You see that it's pretty stable over many decades, and then post 2010, it explodes. While in the academy, there's also these spikes, but it has been more gradual in general. Although there's also terms that probably were not used very much a few decades ago, and they also explode. But there is a difference here.